Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. Today we've got a special live stream. It's a mix of a few things. It's a bit of an injury update, but also a special update in terms of these new COVID regulations in the Premier League, because we've had a few players out with the virus. I guess because we're live as well, we've been watching the Liverpool-West Ham game. Do you want to give a quick indication on what's happened there with Bowen, Ben?
Yeah, literally just in the last sort of 2 minutes, we've seen Jarrod Bowen limp off. It didn't look too much in the tackle. I think it was maybe by, well, I don't know if it was Robbo or Trent, I forget. But it didn't look a great deal in that. Jarrod sort of jumped up, missed his chance, but then went back down and hurt his, initially thought it was maybe a right ankle or foot problem, but it looks to be more around that Achilles area. So non-contact Achilles, always a concern, always a worry. Physios come on, he tried to continue, but even, they were going to take him onto the side, off the side of the pitch to do a little bit of work, and quickly it became apparent that he couldn't continue. They contacted the bench and he was replaced immediately. So again, that's a little bit of a concern and a worry, the fact that he's been withdrawn immediately.
So let's move from Jarrod Bowen there, because obviously we don't have too much insight on that one, but there has been 2 confirmed, is that correct, Ben? Aston Villa COVID cases. But the game hasn't been cancelled because there are the new Premier League COVID regulations. So do you mind kind of just going through, because there is actually a lot to get through in terms of this, and I think this will be useful for the FPL community or betting community, whatever you do in terms of interacting with the Premier League. But you kind of need to know what happens with players or teams if there are a certain number of COVID cases. So yeah, just talk us through what has now changed.
Yeah, so certainly within the Premier League, we know that there's been a change, in government protocol in terms of you're not legally bound anymore to self-isolate. Within the Premier League, how has that impacted? Well, COVID seems to have slipped under the radar. Now it isn't, front and center like it was maybe in and around sort of December and January. And of course, Premier League have changed their guidelines with regards to how games can be postponed. But Premier League teams continue to assess their players twice weekly. And that's an indication that, if players are testing positive, that they must self-isolate, they must spend time away from the grounds. Now, typically what we've seen in the past, players have been submitting PCR tests. Now, I would say for the majority of cases, they're relying upon this PCR, on the lateral flow test and not the PCR test, to identify those positive cases. And a lot of questions that always get sort of levied, particularly within the fantasy community, is when we're hearing from pre-match press conferences and we hear coaches and managers talk, they're happy to divulge information about certain injuries and possible return to play, but there's often a very guarded answers with regards to COVID. And people are wondering, is there something with regards to maybe medical confidentiality that's actually stopping the clubs from announcing why, updates, particularly COVID cases for players? What I would suggest is, and what we've actually been told is, there isn't. But the reason the clubs are, like I say, particularly guarded is because of people like you and me, Jason, because of people like in the fantasy community, because of journalists, because of those investigative reporters. What they're trying to do, they're trying to patch together and put together stories. So if clubs are saying they have positive tests, that will inherently lead to further questions about where have those players been, who have they been in close contact with, when are they coming back, were they positive, or are you testing from when they had symptomatic? And what we've seen, or what the clubs have experienced in recent times, is these journalists and these reporters and these researchers will go through players' social media timelines. They will look from the internet and they will try to put together a story and link players to certain activities, to certain social activities, and also close contacts to see potentially who else could be affected and when inherently these players can actually return to play.
Now, we do have a comment here from G. Rid. I don't know if I totally agree with the sentiments there, but he does have a point saying that Premier League players are valuable assets, and this is leading the way with continuing monitoring and treatment. In terms of that then, Ben, what is the kind of process if a player does test positive? Are they still allowed to train with their teammates now? Because previously they would have had to have done that from home, a work from home environment, if you will.
Yeah, so this is a really a major step forward, and we talk about expediting that return to play, quickening up that process, and this is good maybe for people like me who are owners of Lucas Digne, in that double game week, and the possibility of them being able to return on Thursday against Leeds. Now, like I say, in terms of the legalities around self-isolation, the government says, well, no, there just isn't a legal requirement to do that anymore. But the fact that Premier Leagues are testing at least for the remainder of this month, for March, we don't know what's going to happen beyond that. What we do know, because if players do test, they will have to self-isolate. However, you touched upon it there. In previously, players would have to maybe, if players were asymptomatic, then they would have to work or train or continue to try and maintain some kind of base level fitness in and around that home, maybe a home gym, not ideal treadmill. However, now there's nothing stopping players from traveling individually into the club, into the training ground, and working in isolation, either in the gym through like a booking process, or even out on the football pitch away from everybody else, so they can do a lot of their sports specific work actually at the club. And again, what that means is when they're able to submit a negative test, hopefully on consecutive days at day 5 and day 6, then they can return and rejoin the group.
And this is the interesting thing as well, is it with the specific training as well, people were kind of limited to the time that they could spend around players, couldn't they? Whereas now that there is no time limit, whether that's legal or club bound, and I guess every club will have their own different kind of COVID regulations. There's no uniformity now. They can work with these players if they want to.
Yeah, so typically with backroom staff and when it comes to treatment protocols, there was a limitation in place that restricted, say, manual therapists, physiotherapists from working with a player for a maximum of 15 minutes, as long as they had their facial masks on. Now, with the new protocols in place, they can, they have to continue wearing those face masks, but they can effectively work with that player on a one-to-one basis for as long as they want, for as long as that treatment is required. So that, in terms of, again, expediting that return to play, minimizing the risk of recurrence, re-injury, then, it's another positive step forward.
One of the interesting things, though, in terms of this topic, we've done the number crunching for the season. Normally, players were taking about 14.7 days to come back. Now, kind of looking at that information, maybe that might speed up the process of some players coming back. That average return to play might go down. But there also is the reality that this is an illness. This will affect people very differently, and kind of post-January we've seen fluctuations up to 18, 19 days out of some of these players. So maybe the word of warning here from you, Ben, is don't always kind of trust that, okay, this player has COVID, the new regulations state this, and so they should be back fairly soon. Don't gamble on that still, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty what we've had is, and this is around disclosure and just really trying to understand the data. Different variants affect different people in different ways. What we do know from the latest variant, or the latest major variant, the Omicron, it doesn't seem to have a bigger effect on the players, on people, as maybe some of those previous variants. So a lot of those positive test players actually asymptomatic, which again, so it allows them to continue to do some baseline training on the pitch, at the club, and again, so that will reduce that timeline, not for all, but certainly in a lot of cases.
So I think that is basically all that we needed to update the community with, because I think it's useful to know this information, maybe to plan around if teams have outbreaks. Yeah. I guess the final question for you is, how many players now is it needed for games to be postponed? Because that was the big thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, say that clubs at one point, there wasn't a breakdown of first team players in terms of numbers announced by the clubs. We heard from Manchester United. I think at one point they announced they had 18 members of the team who were positive tested. How many of those actually affected their first team? Nobody really knows. It could have been backroom staff, it could have been under 23s. The Premier League have been a lot more stringent in terms of, postponing games for COVID issues now. And like I say, with this latest variant, I wouldn't really expect there to be any, between now and the end of the season. I mean, one thing to touch upon, certainly with regards to, that potential return to play, just because a player maybe submits those negative tests on maybe day 5 and day 6. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be thrown straight back in there and ready to play. They talk about maybe doing some submaximal fitness tests on the bike just to make sure that the player's okay. Now, if they've been asymptomatic, there's been no symptoms, there have been no problems, then usually, there's no need to do any further tests with that. However, like I say, on the rare occasions, there may be a complaint of a shortness of breath, maybe, or chest pains. And, clubs obviously will want to protect the players. They don't want to take any unnecessary risk. And then players may go for an ECG, an electrocardiogram, just to check their heart rhythm and an electrical activity, just to make sure that everything's okay. You don't want to leave any stone unturned. You don't want to take any risk with regards to that. There's also the possibility that they may look to do some blood tests, but those blood tests must be taken at least 48 hours after any exercise activity. And the reason being, exercise activity raises cardio enzymes in the heart. It's troponin. And levels of troponin, elevated levels, have been found in at least 50%, according to some studies, elevated levels in hospitalized COVID-19 cases. So again, like I say, players returning, it isn't a surefire guaranteed, meaning that they're going to return and be in contention for the next game. Clubs, it's still a very serious matter. There are still serious implications to this virus. And like I say, players and clubs would rather manage players conservatively and introduce them gradually, than taking any particular risks.
I'm doing a Columbo right here, but this is on behalf of Barry Walls. Just one more question, Ben. So what are the odds of Dinnery being back for Thursday? Still slim, Barry has asked.
In terms of coming back to the matchday squad, I would be fairly optimistic. However, of course, we've seen Aston Villa with a great result today, arguably probably one of their best performances of the season. So then you have to question, will Steven Gerrard want to change things too much following that 4-0 result? They've got a big game. I think they may play West Ham 3 days later. So again, that's a team who could potentially be pushing, for those Champions League qualifying places. It may be that Steven Gerrard sticks with the same 11 and then he makes and implements changes maybe for that West Ham game, when you may say the likes of Lucas Digne and Ezri Konsa back. Again, that gives them a few extra days on the training pitches. They will come back fully refreshed. There are no concerns with regards to that match fitness and sharpness. They've only spent what would be a small handful of days away from the group, so that won't be a big thing. And like I say, with those games in quick succession, he may want to freshen things up, and that be sort of quite a nice or two very appealing assets who you'd like to bring into your team.
So for everybody on the stream, and obviously we're uploading this so that you can watch after as well, I hope you have found this useful. And if you have any more questions, you can always tweet me or Ben at Ben Dinnery at Twitter, or me at Jason_R_McKenna. And you can also comment on any of our videos, and we will try and use our diligence to spot those and answer them as quickly as possible. Hit the subscribe button so that you have the most up-to-date and most accurate injury news as possible. There's no rumour, no misinformation here. It's all the best kind of information that you can get your hands on. But for now, I'm going to wish you the best of luck. I hope you have a good end to your weekend, but maybe not as good as ours in terms of FPL or